I will be working on practice sheet for 1B negative exponents. I will be doing the even numbers. If you'd like to see the answer for the other numbers, you can always log into Edmodo and I have a complete answer key. Now let's start with number 2. So every time you are multiplying, what you do is you add the powers. You copy over the base and you add negative 4 plus 7. So negative 4 plus 7 is a 3, so the final answer is x cubed. That would be your final answer. So remember, every time you multiply, you have to add the powers. Now, let's move on to number 4. When you have a power, you have to move it to every single number or variable in the parentheses. So it's going to be 3 to the power negative 4 and y to the power negative 4. Now, remember, every time you have a negative exponent, it means that this has to be flipped. It means if it's on the top of the fraction, it has to go to the bottom of the fraction. So you just put over 1, you move the 3 to the negative 4 down and the y to the negative 4 down. So the final answer would be 1 over, so basically you flip the fraction, 3 to the 4th and y to the 4th. Now 3 to the 4th means 3 times 3 times 3 times 3. Remember, my pre-AP, you are not allowed to use a calculator. So it's 9 times 9, which is 81, y 4th. So that is going to be your final answer. So remember, every time you have a power on the outside of the parentheses, you have to distribute it to every single number or variable over there. So let's move on to number 6. The same concept. So you have to distribute the negative 2 to each one in the parentheses. So it's going to be 4 to the power negative 2. And since a already has a power, so you need to multiply the power. So it's 3 times negative 2. So it would be 4 to the negative 2 and a to the negative 6. So remember, a power to a power means you have to multiply those powers. Now, since they are negative, you have to flip the fraction and move them down. So it's going to be 1 over 4 to the 2nd and a to the 6th. So it's 1 over 4 times 4 is a 16, a to the 6th, and that would be your final answer. Now let's move on to the number 8. Again, even though it's a fraction, you still need to distribute the power to each one of them. So it's going to be x to the power 3 times negative 5 over y to the power negative 2 times negative 5. So 3 times negative 5 would be negative 15. So let's write it down. X to the power negative 15 over y to the power positive 10. Now, as you can see, x to the power negative 15 is has a negative exponent, so you need to move it down. However, y to the power 10 has a positive exponent, so it stays where it is. So it's going to be 1 over x to the power 15, y to the power 10. So remember, since you move x to the 15th down, there's nothing left on the numerator, so you have to put the 1. So the final answer is 1, x to the 15th, y to the 10th. Now let's move on to number 10. Now, as you can see, you have numbers. So 10 divided by 15. You don't have to give me a decimal number, you can just simplify them. They can both be simplified by 5. So 10 divided by 5 is a 2, 15 divided by 5 is a 3, so the answer is going to be 2 over 3. Now those two, you can simplify them, and remember, every time you divide, you have to subtract the powers. Or if you think that it's going to be harder for you, what you can do, because then if you subtract the powers, it's going to be a little bit complicated if you're not using a calculator. So it's better if you flip them, making them positive. It would be easier for you to calculate. So then this way it's going to be n to the 8th and n to the 5th. This is easier to calculate. Now remember, the reason why we had to move them is because n was to a power negative 5 and n to the power negative 8th. To get rid of the negative power, you switch its place in the fraction. So Again, let's go back to those two now. Since they are being divided, so what you do is you subtract your powers. So it's going to be 2 over 3 and 8 minus 5. So 2 over 3 n to the third. As you can see, it was easier to subtract 8 minus 5 to give you a 3. Easier than subtracting negative 5 minus negative 8. If you can do it, it's fine. I can show you. So negative 8 minus negative 8, or negative 5 minus negative 8, those negatives will become a positive, so negative 5 plus 8 is a 3. So then this is how you get n to the third if you use this method. Or you can just switch the n's, much easier to subtract 8 minus 5. So let's repeat. Every time you have negatives, you have to switch its place in the fraction. So this has to go down to the denominator, and this has to go up to the numerator. Once you move them, they lose the negative exponent and they become positive. And then since you are dividing, you have to subtract the power. 8 minus 5 is 3. Now the 10 and the 15, you have to simplify this fraction by getting 2/3. Now let's move on to... Now, as you can see, the 3 is outside the parentheses, so you carry it over. Anything to the power 0 is a 1, so 3 times 1 is a 3. That would be your final answer. Now, let's move on to number 14. Now, as you can see, there is x8 on the top and x to the negative 2 on the bottom. So what you can do, you can subtract them, or you can just move x to the negative 2 up. It would be easier, so move the x to the power negative 2 up, so it becomes x to the power 2. Now, as you can see, x to the power 8 stays where it is since it had a positive exponent. Now the y12 stays down since it has a positive exponent. However, the y negative 14 has to go down to become positive. So as you can see, whenever it's a positive exponent, it's easier to deal with. Now, so you had to move the x negative 2 up, and you had to move the y negative 14 down. Now, as you can see, you are multiplying those two. Every time you multiply, you have to add the exponent, so it's x to the power 10. Again, it's the same concept. Since you are multiplying the y's, so you add the powers, so you get 14 plus 12 is a 26. So it's x over 10, or x to the 10th, over y to the 26. So every time you multiply, you add the exponents. Now let's move on to number 16. Now what you can do, since you have numbers and you are multiplying, so let's get rid of the numbers. 2 times 5 is a 10. Now we have this x and this x. Since we are multiplying, we have to add the exponents. Now I know that this is a negative 8. You can push it down, but you can do this later, or you can do it now. I prefer if you do it later. So negative 8 plus 3, so we're adding those two exponents since we are multiplying the x's, so it's going to be x to the negative 5. I'm going to write it here. And then y negative 2 is all alone, so I'm going to just copy it over. So 2 times 5 is a 10. The x's, since they're being multiplied, I added the exponents to get a negative 5, and you just carry the y negative 2 over. Now, so whether you move the negative exponent down from the beginning or you leave it to the end, it's the same thing. It's whatever makes your work easier. So since this is negative, it has to go down and this has to go down. So it's 10 over x to the 5th and y to the 2nd. That would be your final answer. Now let's move on to 18. So the 4 has to go to each one of them. So let's do that. So it's going to be negative 2 to the 4th. Now, since you have a negative over here and the power is even, so it has to be positive. Remember, if you have a negative number and you are raising it to an even power, it will become positive. If you have a negative number and you're raising it to an odd number like 3, it will stay negative. So since here the power is even, it becomes plus. Now, so we 2 to the 4th and then c. As you can see, there's already a power over here, so you need to multiply 2 times 4, which is 8. And then let's copy the d. Now, as you can see, It already has a power, so negative 6 times 4. So you need to multiply the powers over here. Remember, multiply the powers if it already has a power and raised to a power. So negative 6 times 4 is a negative 24. So the negative becomes a positive since it's an even exponent. C already has an exponent, so you need to multiply those two to get 8. D already has an exponent, so negative 6 times 4 is a negative 24. Now 2 to the 4th, you can just copy it. C8. Now what happens to these, that has to go down to change to a positive exponent. Remember, you should never have an answer with a negative exponent. You should always have positive exponents. Now this is number 18. Now let's move on to number 20. Now this one, you might think that it's complicated, but take your time, do it one step at a time, and it will be easy. But you need to divide your work. Now since you have a negative 2, move the negative 2 to each one in the parentheses. So it's going to be 5 to the power negative 2, a to the power 4, since negative 2 times negative 2 is a positive 4, and then b, again, 3 times negative 2 is a negative 6, over. So as you can see, you need to give the negative 2 to each one in the parentheses. And you do the same thing to the bottom. So it's going to be 6 to the power negative 2, and c, negative 1 times negative 2 is a positive 2, so it has to be positive 2. So you change this one to this by distributing the power to each one in the parentheses. Now you copy the second one. As you can see, there is no power in the second one, so you copy it as it is. Let's do that. It's going to be 5a negative 2 c2 over 3b negative 4. Now, to make your work easier, try to get rid of the negative exponents. So move this down. So create two fractions. Now, so the 5 to the second has to go down. You keep this in its place since it's positive. You have to move this down. So b to the 6. Now the c2, it's positive, so it stays where it is. And the 6 negative 2 is a negative, so it has to go up. So it is 6 to the power 2. So as you can see, you had to move this one down, there you go, this one down, there you go, and this one up, there you go. And the others, like A4, it stays where it is, and the C2 stays where it is. Now this looks much better than this one with all the negatives. Now let's move on to the next one. Now as you can see, this is negative, so it has to go down. So when you move it down, it becomes positive. This is negative, so it has to go up. So it becomes positive. Everything else stays in its place. So the 5 is up, stays, C2 stays, and 3 up stays. So far, as you can see, it looks much better than all of those negatives. These are things I can work with. So let's move, make some room. Now, after you distribute the power and after you get rid of the negatives, now let's go ahead and work with the numbers that I have. So let's start with the letters. Now, there's an A4 over here, and there's an A to the power 2 over here. These are the two A's. Since one is on top and one is on bottom, it means you are dividing, so you subtract the powers. So A, 4 minus 2. It would become A to the power 2. So let me erase this and put A to the power 2. So we're done with the A's. Now, so as you can see, if you do it one step at a time, create a fraction and put things where you find them fit. Now, so every time you divide, when you divided that, the answer has to go up, and then if it's negative, you move its place. Now, the next one I'm going to be working with is the B's. So this is a B, and this is a B. So B4 over B6 If you like and you feel more comfortable, put it on the side. So since you are dividing, you have to subtract the powers. So it's going to be b 4 minus 6. So every time you divide, you put the work on the top. 4 minus 6 is a negative 2, so you put negative 2. Now as you can see, it's a negative exponent, so you need to move it down. Keep that in mind. Now we're done with the b. Now let's move on to the c. This is c squared, and this is c squared, so basically they cancel each other. Nothing's going to be left. Now what I'm going to be left with is all the numbers. So it's 6 squared times 5 over 5 squared times 3. So you can also write it on the side. It might be easier for you to solve. So 6 squared, I copied it, 5. Both are on top, so that's why you put them on top. And 5 squared and 3 are on bottom, so you put them on bottom. Maybe it's easier for you to solve this way. Now, 6 squared is a 36. So let me write it down. Times 5. 5 squared is a 25 times 3. Now, if you can simplify, it's easier for you than to multiply 36 times 5 and then divide it by whatever 25 times 3 is. So let's simplify it. If you simplify by 5, this will become 1 and this will become 5. If you simplify by 3, this will become 1 and this will become 12. So then the final answer is 12 over 5. So you put 12 over 5. Now remember what you said earlier, that the b negative 2 has to go down. So you cancel it from here and you put it down. So then the final answer is going to be 12a squared over 5b squared. So this is it for 4.1b. As you can see, it has everything in it, every single law. So I hope this helps. Study well, and if you have any questions, let me know.